Hi everyone, it's Mike Bird here. I'm about to head off to the United States for a whole bunch of conferences in Denver, Colorado. But before I do, I want to tell you about a couple of books on Christology that I have been involved in. The first one is called Jesus Among the Gods, Early Christology in the Greco-Roman World. That book has an interesting backstory. That is my COVID book, the book I wrote through the, how many years of COVID was it? I can't remember now. It's all a blur. But it all started when I was in Washington State. I was in this sleepy little town called Bellingham. That's the headquarters of Logos, or the Faith Life Corporation. And I went into this charming bookstore downtown, found some secondhand books, found a copy of Plutarch's uh, Isis and Osiris in the Loeb series, and I was reading through it, and I found this point where Plutarch, and he's an ancient philosopher and biographer, and he says when it comes to the worship of Heracles, there's two types of worship of Heracles. There's one where he's an unbegotten god, and one where he is a begotten god. So one where he's kind of like an eternal being, and another one where he's kind of like a deified human being. And I thought, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, Plutarch is roughly like first century, so the same time as perhaps Josephus or John the Seer, maybe Luke, and all that language of being begotten or unbegotten. I thought that was part of like the third and fourth century technical Christian language, part of their metaphysical speculation about what is the nature of a god, or how is Jesus a god like the Father without being the same as the Father. So I just assumed that kind of ontological language about being begotten or unbegotten was specifically Christian and specifically late. But it turns out it's not. In antiquity, amongst Greeks and Romans, they divided the gods into two categories: the uncreated, unbegotten gods, and then there were the begotten gods, or human beings who had somehow entered into the pyramid, the spectrum of divinity. And that led to a pretty interesting question. Well, if that's the two types of gods, if that's kind of, column A or column B, um, which one do you put Jesus in? I mean, where do you put him? I mean, is he a begotten, a deity, kind of like a human being who was adopted as God's son, or became deified when he received the Holy Spirit, something like that? Or was he an eternal, unbegotten God? I mean, I think that's the impression you certainly get in Hebrews and in the Gospel of John. Now, I did find a few other authors had been thinking along these lines, using these sort of categories, notably Jerome Newry in Hebrews, Jürgen Frey in the Gospel of John, and even Gabriele Boccaccini also in the Gospel of John. So that this wasn't out of left field. Some other people were using these sort of categories. So I thought, well, maybe we need to go back to the question of ontology. And that's significant because in the study of early Christology, where Christology began, it's normally assumed all that language of metaphysics, the nature or substance of a deity. I mean, that all begins in the second century, where the church and its theologians and apologists get drunk on Greek philosophy, and then eventually evolves into the Nicene dogmas, which are a world away from the New Testament. Because the New Testament, the Christology is either functional, Jesus has, certain functions that are kind of like God, but that doesn't really make him God, or it's about a divine identity, or it's about a divine worship, or it's about comparing Jesus to other intermediary figures like the Enochic Son of Man, like Melchizedek from Qumran, or the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, or a deified Roman emperor. I mean, that's meant to be the analog or the context for early Christology. Whereas I want to say, you know what? I'm starting to think maybe ontology, the study of being, when it comes to a divinity and as applied to Christ, maybe that doesn't begin in the second century. Maybe it's there in the first century. And so I try to rehabilitate the category of ontology for the study of early Christology. And I'm doing that in the context of Greco-Roman philosophy, Greco-Roman religion. Because the other thing I discovered is that Greco-Roman religion does have a significant element of theology to it. I mean, the line I was sold is Greco-Roman religion was about ritual, but Christianity is about theology. That dichotomy is not true. Where Christians were unique, where Christians were, perhaps distinctive, is that they liked policing other people's beliefs, particularly when it comes to magic, superstition, and certainly the category of heresy. So Christians were very good at, in their own circles, policing beliefs, about what is, the right thing to believe about God, the nature of Christ, the Holy Spirit, that kind of a thing. But the idea that there were beliefs about the gods that were embodied, lived out, or applied in ritual, I mean, that was part of the Greco-Roman world. Greco-Roman religion did have a theology, even if it was only implicit. And it wasn't just a few philosophers who were kind of speculating on this stuff. There was a lot of thought, a lot of ideas about what a god is, embedded within the ritual world and the context and practice of ancient religion. So that's one thing I wanted to do in this book, is rehabilitate ontology, what is a god, and look at the early New Testament and early patristic authors, and look at, what kind of God do they say Jesus is? And you get some interesting things, like, Ignatius of Antioch. He's got a remarkable statement. He says Jesus is begotten in his humanity, but unbegotten in his divinity, which is to say he's, is strongly human, but divine in that more absolute sense. And if you read the Epistle to Diognetus, I think you find something similar. The author there is very strong on saying that he comes as a human being, but he comes as a king who sends a king, or as a father sends a son. He uses that kind of language. Which is very close to the sort of formulas you get in the 4th century, like, in Nicaea and Constantinople, where Jesus is, of the same substance as a human being, and as the same substance of God. He shares in the godness of God. He shares in the humanity of humans. So, I mean, there's all sorts of things like that going on. I mean, I should add there as well, another sort of insight I try to bring is you have to study New Testament Christology or early Christology within the dual context of the Jewish world and the Greco-Roman world. But you've also got to understand early Christology in sort of continuation or in organic unity with patristics. Okay, so you can't just cut off and say this is the end of early Christology. Early Christology really has to be studied up to about 325, maybe even 381. I think you can't really just draw an arbitrary line between the New Testament and patristics, because they do kind of overlap. I mean, some patristic documents like the Didache, 1 Clement, I think they could possibly be older than some parts of the New Testament. So the New Testament and patristic periods do overlap, so you've got to study them together. The other thing I do in this book, besides trying to rehabilitate ontology for the study of early Christology, is I go on a fairly exhaustive survey of ancient intermediary figures. And I'm basically asking the question, in what sense is Jesus similar, and in what sense is he different to these various intermediary figures? And here I'll give you a line from David Litwa. David Litwa says, look, if you focus on similarities, that's just parallelomania. Okay, that's just kind of putting things side by side and saying this is that and flattening out the distinctives between them. Okay. Alternatively, if you focus on the differences, he says, well, that's just apologetics, because you're just trying to prove that the Christian Jesus, the Christian Christ, the God worshipped by the early church, was nothing like the gods of the pagans or the gods of or whatever group we're talking about. Whereas that is untrue. And even patristic authors tell us there are similarities between their account of Jesus and someone like Zeus or Apollo or Hermes, and even they are aware of the fact that the ascension of Jesus is kind of like the deification of an emperor. So that's what I try to do in the second part of the book, and I make some interesting findings. I do now think that ruler cults from the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman world, I do think they are a lot more significant for the study of early Christology. Scholars like Richard Bauckham and Larry Hurtado have argued that ruler cults are mainly relevant when you get to the Book of Revelation. I mean, the Book of Revelation, you've got John the Seer kind of parodying the worship of the Roman emperor as he polemicizes against the imperial cults. That's the worship as the Roman emperor of the god, because that's happening in Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. But what I argue is, Psalm 110 basically makes Jesus a throne sharer with Yahweh. I mean, that's a Christian interpretation of it. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool. And that is a common trope in ancient ruler cults, from the pharaohs to the Hellenized East, Alexander the Great, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, all the way through to the Roman gods being co-enthroned with Roman emperors and other people being enthroned with Roman emperors. It's part and parcel. So ruler cults are really influencing early Christology wherever you have Psalm 110. So that's one thing I kind of learned to argue. The other thing I discovered is that, oh boy, angel Christology is everywhere. This surprised me a bit. I mean, you could argue that, in the Epistle of Jude, there seems to be a implicit rendering of Jesus, who was the angel of the Lord who saved the Israelites from Egypt. I think that's implied. I don't think there's a lot of other angel Christology in other parts of the New Testament beyond Jude and the Book of Revelation. In the Book of Revelation, it's definitely there, but it's complex, it's contested, on which parts are more of an angel Christology. And that doesn't mean Jesus is an angel. It simply means he's described with angel-like characteristics, okay? But in the 2nd century, this really does take off. And whether you're talking about Justin Martyr, the Marcionites, the Valentinians, or sundry groups, probably the only thing they would really agree on Christologically is that Christ was an angel of some sort. Now, I think Tertullian sums it up where he says Jesus is God by nature, but he can be an angel by function. So he can function a bit like an angel in, giving messages to the churches, or he kind of is the one who descends through the heavens and comes to earth. There's some interesting stories about how Mary becomes pregnant by the angel Gabriel, and Gabriel was really Jesus. There's some really weird stuff like that going on. But yeah, angel Christology, particularly in the 2nd century, it really is ubiquitous. And I know you get a little bit of it in Jude and a little bit of it in the Book of Revelation. I don't really see it in Paul. But yeah, that is really big in the 2nd century, and unpacking that took me a long time. There was a lot of stuff in the book about that, so I find that fascinating. The way the book ends up, though, is I kind of get into the discussion, should early Christology be situated within the context of ancient Judaism, or in the context of the Greco-Roman religion? And the answer, of course, yeah, it's a bit of both. Okay, it's a bit of both, because there are clearly Jewish influences on the articulation of who Jesus is, in light of the scriptures, in light of Second Temple literature, that kind of a thing. But at the same time, you can't deny that there is obvious relevancies from Greco-Roman religion, philosophy, the way they speak about divine beings. I mean, you get both of them, but often it's posited as an either-or thing. And I mean, you do get a little bit of a paradox, like the great scholar Martin Hengel. He argued that all of Judaism was influenced by Hellenism. Okay, so all of Judaism in the 1st century is influenced by the Greco-Roman world that's been imported there since the time of Alexander the Great. But then when it comes to Christology, he wants to say the primary influences are Jewish rather than Hellenistic. He he uses a Hellenistic Judaism, like, Philo and, the sort of, Greekness of the evangelist John. He wants to say, well, that's where the Greekness comes from. It doesn't come directly from paganism, but any Hellenistic influences come from Hellenistic Judaism. So Hellenistic Judaism becomes a bit of a buffer or a bodyguard which allows you to have some Greek influence in Christianity, but it means there's not a direct pagan influence. Now, a lot of people have said that's a little bit of a cop-out, to Martin Hengel. He's exaggerating the differences between Hellenistic Judaism and pure Hellenism. And I think that to a degree is a valid response to what Martin Hengel was doing. The difference is, I think you still can maintain a difference between Judaism and Hellenism, okay? I don't think we simply have to regard ancient Judaism as just Hellenism, without a foreskin. I think Judaism and Hellenism are different things, and we know that because ancient authors told us they were. That said, I do think we have to accept the fact that it is a far more messy, complex swirl of ideas and influences as the early Christians tried to think about who is Jesus and come up with the tools, the language, the concepts, and the categories to think about who Jesus really is. And where I end up is I say, look, let's have a look at the book of Hebrews. Now, this is a book, it's written in Greek. It's clearly got some affinity with Platonic philosophy and Platonic categories. So it's a deeply Hellenistic work. It's also steeped in ancient rhetorical strategies. So in terms of underlying philosophy, in terms of language and rhetoric, Hebrews is fundamentally a Hellenistic work. But, and here's the thing, 25% of the book is made up from quotations from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And for all the parallels there could be with Plato and Plutarch, the number one text influencing the book of Hebrews is basically the Old Testament in Greek. And that is clear from verse 1 all the way through to chapter 13. So yes, hat tip to Greco-Roman influence. We don't want to do that in the somewhat clunky way that Martin Hengel did. But at the end of the day, if you have to pick a side on what is more formative for early Christianity and it's an account of Jesus, it's Christology, then the answer has to be hands down Jewish influences. Again, not completely, because Hellenism is part of the picture, and you can't explain how we go from Nazareth to Nicaea without people like Philo, Plutarch, Plato, Stoicism, and all that sort of thing. But yeah, so that's kind of what the book is about, trying to bring ontology back into the ancient accounts of Christology. It's about looking at the various intermediary figures that you can compare Jesus to, and then finally trying to, figure out, is the main influence on early Christology Jewish sources like the Old Testament, or is it Greco-Roman sources? Okay, so that's in a nutshell what the book Jesus Among the Gods is about. But at the same time, I've had another little book come out. This one is edited by Bob Stewart from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. Great place, great guy, Bob Stewart. And this is basically a transcript of a debate I did with Bart Ehrman. Now, Ehrman is a bit of a boogeyman to evangelicals, that kind of, best-selling New York author who writes a number of books. I mean, sometimes trying to debunk the New Testament or the early church. I mean, what he really does, he introduces certain problems we know about, whether that's the text of the Bible, about early Christology, the problem of evil. He covers all that, but he does it in a very dramatic way. Not in a conspiratorial way, but certainly he has a panache for the dramatic, and it's a little bit like, if you know anything about ancient studies, it's a little bit like that arch biblical critic from Germany in the 19th century, David Strauss, married with P.T. Barnum, the famous guy who invented the circus. So he's kind of David Strauss, P.T. Barnum. Very engaging, very entertaining, and you can learn quite a lot from him. It's often, he's usually right about some things, partly right about some things, but then he takes really weird, obscure minority positions and tries to make them sound like they're mainstream scholarship. Like the idea that in in Galatians when Paul says, you know, you welcome me like Christ as an angel himself, as if Paul is implying there that Christ actually is an angel. So, but he's interesting. And I'll be honest with you, when it comes to Christology, I have softened a little bit in my criticism of Bart. There's probably a couple of places where I would say in hindsight, I probably should have given him more credit. I mean, that's despite the fact that I think I disagree with his fundamental thesis. But this is the book we did together, and it's called When Did Jesus Become God? I mean, the debate, you can watch itself on YouTube, but if you actually want to, you know, do it in like, you know, slow motion, you're better off reading the book and, you know, going through it, and you can see the discussion we have, both our initial presentations and the interaction between the two of us. So yeah, I mean, that's good. This means, by the way, I'm the only guy out there who was, I think, co-authored books with both N.T. Wright and Bart Ehrman, and that, I think, is probably a pretty significant achievement, I guess. But that's a fun book you might want to check out if you want to know about early Christology, some of the debates that are literally taking place in the academy over who is Jesus and in what sense did the early Christians think Jesus was God. I mean, I think Bart is good at asking that question. From the moment of the resurrection, or, you know, belief in the resurrection, very least, everyone believed Jesus was God. The question was, in what sense is he God? And we've got some different ideas of that. But yeah, so these are the two books. You might want to check them out. If you do, you can always ask me any questions in the on the YouTube channel if you're watching, or contact me through the blog if you're listening to the podcast version. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope to do a few more Nazareth to Nicaea episodes, probably in the new year after Christmas. In the meantime, I'm about to head off to the United States, going to Denver, going to go enjoy some nice omelets and catch up with some scholarly friends I haven't seen for about 3 years. So if you're going to be in the Denver area, I look forward to seeing you about. I'm actually speaking at Denver Seminary on the topic of religious freedom, you know, my other hobby horse besides early Christology. And yeah, if you're there, I look forward to seeing you around. Otherwise, God bless you all.